Once the heroes of a rescue team reached a dog that was chained up close to a fire, they were relieved to be in time. But this little dog had no plans to be rescued. He refused to leave his place and gave his all to protect what was hidden underneath him. Well, this story proves why dogs are considered loyal animals. The poor little dog had to be forced to leave his rug, exposing what he was protecting with his life. As they got closer to the dog and managed to untie him, the rescuers expected to see the dog run off in a great hurry to get to safety. But he refused. He stayed right there and loudly barked at every rescuer that was trying to get close. The dog was willing to give his life. Once the rescuers opened up the woodwork underneath the little dog, they were completely shocked. As they were a part of the fire department, they had seen many things, but nothing like this. They couldn't believe their eyes and had to react quickly in order to prevent any more casualties from the fire. After finally opening up the woodwork and seeing what was hidden, they looked at the dog differently. The dog had been very hostile towards them until that point and gave them little reason to trust him. But the dog turned out to be absolutely right about his instincts. But what was underneath the woodwork? What was the dog protecting with his life? And why did it leave the rescuers shocked? A mall right on the outskirts of the city was on fire. A rescue team from the fire department arrived at the location, making a plan on how to extinguish the fire. They separated into two different teams. One team would go straight for the fire, and the other team would rescue people and, as we know, animals. During the opening minutes of their mission, they were notified about a barking little dog. They were given a location on the backside of the mall, close to an abandoned warehouse. It didn't take the rescue team long before they spotted the dog. He was barking like crazy, and the rescuers made sure to untie him right away. This was the moment they realized this was no regular dog. The dog barked even louder now that he was liberated and refused to leave his rug. One of the rescuers tried to get a little closer, but the dog was very protective and started showing his teeth. The rescue team took their conclusion and decided to look for casualties or people to be rescued. Little did they know, they were to return very soon. The rescue team continued their rescue with the idea that the dog would probably eventually leave, especially when the situation would become too dangerous to stay. And dangerous it would be. So why did the dog stay? Why couldn't it be approached? And why didn't it respond to the upcoming danger? As soon as the rescue team got closer to the fire and away from the dog, they realized the fire could be bigger than expected. The fire appeared to get bigger and bigger, and the rescuers had to rush to save casualties. One of the team members, James, was appointed to take care of the dog, as he might have been in danger. James did not hesitate. He realized an animal was just as important to save and rushed back to the poor little dog. Looking back, thanks to his dedication, he managed to get the dog out in time. But whether he would be able to save what was underneath the dog was very questionable. But it wouldn't take long before James would run into his first trouble along the way. He tried to take the same route they had taken earlier, but this time the hallway was no option, due to all the smoke. He didn't know what to do as time was running out. James was contemplating his options and chose the riskiest one. Without thinking and against all protocol, James powered through the smoke clouds. It was a race against the clock, and so he decided to waste no time. The little dog had to be saved, and thus a little risk could do no harm. But little did he know, he had even less time than he thought, and he was about to find out why. James's risk was paying off, and he was finally getting a little closer. But things weren't looking bright just yet. When he saw the dog and called for him to calm him down, he got interrupted by a civilian. He told the civilian to get to safety and tried to walk past him, but the civilian had other ideas. The civilian claimed to be the owner of the dog. James looked at him with great interest. He doubted whether the civilian was speaking the truth. After all, wasn't he preventing James from rescuing his dog? Things looked suspicious, and James was aware of it. He then asked the civilian a smart question in order to find out about his real intentions. "Well, certainly, sir, but if you don't mind, what's the name of your dog?" The civilian was stunned by this simple question and had no answer. He just stared at James. James, by now, knew enough and walked past the civilian, telling him once more to get to safety. But then, the desperate civilian did something unexpected. The civilian started running toward the little dog. When he reached the dog, he fell down next to the dog and tried to look at what was underneath it. But the dog didn't give in and kept barking loudly and aggressively. James, by now, had caught up and scared the civilian off by telling him to leave. Who was this strange man, and what was he looking for? James decided to try and win over the little dog's trust. This wouldn't be easy. He had two options: either take his time to make the dog feel comfortable and lead him away from his rug, or lift him off it and disturb the dog by doing so. He didn't want to traumatize the little dog and decided to take his time. James tried to calm him and reassure him by petting him and making playful noises. It slowly started to work, but the dog still refused to leave his rug. In the meantime, James had contact with the rest of the rescue team. They had bad news. They told James the fire might get even bigger. He realized he was running out of time. Even though James was making progress with the dog still didn't trust James. He refused to leave his rug and threatened to bark again when James got too close. Then, James heard a noise coming from underneath the dog. It was almost like a knock, repeating itself multiple times. James was shocked. He got a little closer, trying not to upset the little dog. He looked for the wood that he could clearly hear just now. Apparently, there was a thick sort of shelf. James knocked on it. It was shallow. There must be something underneath. He knocked again and then heard a knock coming from underneath. Who or what could this be? Was James losing his mind? He decided to follow the protocol and called his team captain first. The team captain told James to wait for his team members who were on their way that very instant. If they wouldn't be there within 5 minutes, he was allowed to remove the shelf himself. These 5 minutes felt like the longest 5 minutes of his life. In the meantime, he tried to communicate with whoever or whatever was underneath the shelf, but it was nearly impossible because of the barking dog and all the sirens in the background. Time was running out, and James was losing his nerve. Finally, his team members showed up. They were held up for a second by the civilian from before, who was still around for some reason. But they knew there was no time and pushed him away. Luckily, they brought all sorts of equipment to remove the shelf. Would they be on time? There was no more time to win over the dog, so they lifted him off his rug. He protested, but they took him away to safety. The civilian was still around. He followed every move they made. Once he saw they were close to removing the shelf, he ran off again. What in the world had gotten into this man, and what was he hiding? James's instinct took over. He left the dog and the shelf underneath for his team and decided to follow the civilian instead. The man was surprisingly fast and had gotten a head start, so James had quite some distance to cover. He gave his all, for which he would be rewarded very soon. But the civilian had a trick up his sleeve. He ran into a neighborhood. This particular neighborhood was completely unknown to James, and he didn't feel at ease, not knowing where the civilian was hiding or going. However, James was determined and proceeded to follow the civilian. This man clearly had something to hide. Then, James spotted the civilian. The civilian seemed to think he had escaped James, as he was no longer running and calmly looking ahead of him. James managed to get a little closer without being noticed. He took a risk by cutting him off by trespassing in some gardens and was soon close enough to grab him. James charged the civilian by tackling him, and succeeded. The man tried to resist his grip, but didn't stand a chance against the strong and determined James. He started to scream for help and even tried to bite James's hands to escape. This man was willing to go far for his freedom. James then grabbed a piece of rope and tied the hands of the civilian. He planned on tying his legs as well, but he got interrupted by the sound of his pager while doing so. It was his team leader. He had to answer. Then, James did something that he has regretted ever since. James got off the civilian, whose legs weren't tied down just yet. He stepped away from him and called his team leader. The team leader had a clear message. "We just removed the shelf that was underneath the dog. You have to make sure to catch that civilian. It's a matter of life and death." James couldn't help but smile a little after proudly saying he had already caught the runaway civilian. His team leader was immensely proud and asked him to send a picture to him right away. James agreed and quickly turned around to take the picture. But an ugly surprise was awaiting James. The civilian escaped. James didn't believe his eyes. He started to quickly scan the neighborhood, but didn't see the man anywhere. How could he be so stupid? James called his team leader right away, and after hearing the news, his leader hung up right away. This very moment determined James's future for the worse. James didn't give up and searched the area. Every corner, every abandoned house was a possible hiding place, and James was sure to look in all of them. It didn't take long before the police arrived. One of the agents seemed particularly interested in James. It was Steve, quite young and ambitious, just like James. He'd come to surprise James. "You must be James. I'm obligated to tell you that the man you followed and tried to arrest is an escapee from a mental hospital," Steve said. James didn't know what he was hearing. Then Steve told James to forget about the fire and the little dog, as he was now part of the squad that was to track down the escapee. Steve and James tracked the area once more, while James told Steve everything he knew and noticed about the civilian. In exchange, James asked Steve about the connection between the little dog at the fire, the shelf it was guarding with the knocks underneath it, and the civilian. Steve's answer surprised him. Steve told James that it concerned a state secret. James didn't believe what he was hearing. He tended not to believe Steve. Sure, there was a lot going on and some lives were possibly at risk, but it couldn't be this bad, right? All James needed was a little patience, as everything was about to take another turn. Before James knew it, they left the area and were off to the police station. James was to cooperate with an official statement as a state witness. James collaborated and repeated everything he knew, time after time. It took a long time. But then, something very unexpected was asked of James. James had to give his fingerprints. James didn't agree with this and protested. What? Was he a suspect now? What was the meaning of all this? Wasn't he a rescuer? Didn't he work with the code of honor from the fire department ever since he started his job? Steve then tried to calm him down. Steve took James apart to talk to him as soon as he realized he couldn't get through to him. At first it worked. James calmed down and calmly asked Steve to explain why fingerprints were needed. But Steve lost his trust again when he couldn't answer him. "Why not, Steve?" James's distrust was understandable, as Steve only gave vague answers. "Everyone is a suspect in the eyes of the law," he said at first. James was baffled. Then Steve suddenly said, "You didn't expect us to believe you, just on your word, right? We need more evidence, James. You have to understand." Even though James barely understood what was happening to him, he thought about his next move right away. But what happened in the first place? He? A suspect? What was the police thinking? He decided to call his team leader, who picked up right away. Looking back, this made a vital difference. The team leader wasn't surprised at all. He even told James he was the one that agreed to this. James completely lost his temper. He said, "Just because I let him escape? After all these loyal years, I can't afford to make one mistake?" The team leader told him it wasn't this mistake, but something else that caused him to agree with the police. "No, I trust you on that. It was an honest mistake. This is about the 5 minutes you waited for us after finding the dog, and after hearing the knocks from underneath the dog. You're suspected based on that." James didn't believe what he was hearing. He followed protocol, only to be punished by it? James lost it, hung up his phone, and returned to Steve. Despite his anger, James knew what to do now. He agreed to leave his fingerprints, but only after the police met one of his demands. Steve's confidence would drastically drop after hearing James's demand. Because James demanded to speak to a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. He wanted to speak to the layer that was in service of all firemen. After all, this lawyer could approve of James's actions, following the protocol. Steve clearly didn't like this, James wondered. Did they really need someone to blame? Was this really a state matter? James's lawyer arrived, finally. James thought he was saved, but the lawyer had bad news for him. He couldn't assure James everything would be all right. James couldn't believe it. They went over James's story, and when the lawyer heard about the dog protecting the shelf with possibly someone underneath it, the lawyer jumped up. A knock? From underneath the shelf? And the police are speaking of a state matter? Are you absolutely certain? James nodded his head in confirmation. The lawyer was full of faith all of a sudden. He promised James everything would be all right as he left the room. What was going on? Shortly after, James was released from the police. Steve turned out to be too ambitious as a cop, trying to look good by finding someone to blame for the escape of a mental patient. And, as it turned out, the little dog was indeed guarding someone. And not just anyone. Because underneath the shelf was an abducted person being hidden. This person was there for a while, and the little dog felt responsible for him. The missing of this person was an unsolved case, one of the biggest in the country, causing the police to act too harshly. James received a promotion. The little dog was safe and back with his owners, living a happy life.